Welcome to Carlton's Math Corner. Today, we are going to continue our study on properties. At this time, please make sure that you have your math journal, your vocabulary packet, as well as something to write with. So our target today is I can identify different math properties. Well, we've already talked about quite a few different properties. And so we're going to continue our study on properties, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at a mathematical expression and we're going to evaluate it. And while we are evaluating it, we are going to look at the properties that we use during each step. And so we're going to start off, well, in order of operations, I know that I need to start with parentheses. So I'm going to start with parentheses in this expression. And what I want you to notice is that 1 has been replaced by the 4 minus 3. And this is an example of the substitution property of equality. And what I want to know is, what do you think the definition is of the substitution property of equality? You're absolutely right. It is basically plugging in, so if you look at this little icon, so we're plugging in a number that is equivalent to 4 minus 3, and that number is 1. And so we're going to use that number instead of 4 minus 3. And that's our first step. Now, I know that in order of operations, my second step would be exponents, but I don't have any powers in this problem, so we're going to skip that. The next step, it would be multiplication or division, whichever came first. In this case, we have multiplication. There's 2 of them. There's this expression here, and then there's also this expression that has multiplication. And so we're going to start off with the 7 times the 1. And whenever we multiply something by 1, that is referred to as the multiplicative identity property. Because when you multiply something by 1, that number keeps its identity. And so the 7 actually kept its identity. And so that's why in red we have 7 written down. And so that's our second step. Now, third step, there's another multiplication problem, so we're going to do that. And so looking at this, it's 5 times 1/5. Well, I know that 5 is the same as 5 over 1. Because I can put a 1 under any number, any whole number, and I can make it a fraction. So 5 over 1 is the same as just 5 wholes. And the multiplicative inverse property basically states that if I take 5 first and I multiply it by its inverse, or we call it its reciprocal. It's where it has been flipped. And so 5 over 1 is now 1 over 5. And when I multiply those two together, I get the product of 1. Because 5 times 1 is 5, and 1 times 5 is 5. And when you simplify 5 over 5, we get a product of 1. And so I can put in the number 1 as my product. Now, in order of operations, I know the next step would be addition or subtraction, whichever came first, left to right. And it looks like subtraction comes first. So I am once again going to use substitution. So I'm going to plug it in. I'm going to plug in 6 for 7 minus 1, and I'm going to plug in 7 for 6 plus 1. And my final answer then is 7. Okay, so let's look at our properties and some additional properties. The first one is called the additive identity property. And this basically states that if I add any number to 0, then the identity of that number stays the same. So if I take 2 plus 0, then it stays the same. So I have this lizard here. He will always remain the same because he is always added to 0. So that's the additive identity property. The next property is the additive inverse property, which states that if I take any integer and I add it to its opposite, so if I take -4 and I add it to +4, then I will get 0. The property, we've already talked about this property, substitution property of equality, just states that I can substitute a number in of equal value. I can substitute it in for an expression or for a variable. For instance, if I have 6 times something is equal to 24, I know that I can substitute in 4 because 6 times 4 is 24. Multiplicative identity property we've already talked about. If I multiply any number by 1, the number remains the same and keeps its identity. Multiplicative property of 0 just states that if I multiply by 0, then that product will always be 0. And lastly, we talked about the multiplicative inverse property. It just states if I take any number and multiply by its inverse, or we call that the reciprocal, it will simplify down to 1 whole. So for tonight, your ticket problems. Here are 4 ticket problems. I would like for you to first evaluate them, and then I would like you to tell me what properties did you use to evaluate them. Thank you so much for joining me at Carlton's Math Corner, and I look forward to meeting with you again.